ganglia. That's where it kind of has this. So if we're looking at it like this, okay, you have sensory information coming in. It comes in here, we have the spinal nerve, right, where it's coming together, spinal nerve. And then you're going to have the bulge, which will be the ganglia. So that's what's telling you, okay, this is the dorsal root ganglia, whereas this is the ventral root. Okay? So if you're looking at it like this, incoming afferent sensory information is going to come into the dorsal root ganglia. Then it's going to go to the dorsal root, then to the rootlets. Okay? Then it has to synapse. So sensory information will be in the posterior gray horns. So afferent sensory information will be in the posterior gray horn, this triangle right here at the top. Okay? Now that's what I was trying to tell you the other day. Sensory, it will either be one of two things. It will be visceral, or it'll be motor. But both of them will synapse in the posterior gray horn. Probably spelled that wrong. Is it G-R-A-Y? Okay. In the posterior gray horn, you'll have either visceral or motor. So if we're looking at the horn, kind of like that on each side, right? You have two sections. So we take the posterior gray horn and we divide it into two sections. This first section will be, I think it is motor or somatic. Motor, somatic are the same thing. Okay? This will be visceral or autonomic. Okay, so here's an example. Let's say you have your hair gets plucked off the scalp, right? You feel your hair gets plucked. So you have a tactile receptor, right? And you feel your hair get plucked. So now you have this afferent information coming in through the dorsal root ganglia to the dorsal root, to the dorsal rootlets, to the posterior gray horn, to synapse, right? And then you have to understand when it's synapsing, that means it's going to do it in one of the nuclei. All right, we call these gray matter nuclei. Okay, I know we're used to thinking nuclei with like cells. Nuclei also means just kind of like gray bodies. Okay, so you need to remember that. So it's going to synapse in one of these two nuclei, right? Now, when it does that, you need to understand somatic is something you're aware of. So if your hair gets plucked, what are you? You're aware of that, right? Ouch, it hurts, right? You're aware of it. If it's something to do with the organs, it's going to be visceral. You're not aware of it.
So that'd be like external,
Yeah, like something that's taking it from within, right? It could also be like I was saying, I think over and over again the other day, just because physiology's in my head, like the baroreceptors with like osmotic pressure, things like that. Things that are just out of your control. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Yeah, which would be okay. Yes. Okay. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So you need to understand if it's aware, it will always. If you're aware of it, it will always be motor or somatic. So I kind of like to have a little note here. Remember, this is aware, and remember, this is unaware. Voluntary, involuntary, same thing. So aware would be voluntary. Unaware would be involuntary. Okay, so here's how it would work. You sense that your hair gets plucked. Okay, it goes through to the dorsal root ganglia, to the dorsal root, to the dorsal rootlets, to the posterior gray horn where it synapses. Okay. Because we're aware of it, what's our natural response going to be? Probably to scratch our head, right? Okay, so it's going to synapse here. Okay? Now, the next step after sensory is interneuron. This is where the interneuron is going to go up to the brain via the white column, okay? Via the white matter column, okay? So the interneuron goes up to the brain via the white matter column. So you have, after this synapse, you have an interneuron that's going to take it to the white matter column, which we know these travel up and down. Columns go up and down, right? Okay. White matter will go up and down. Okay, so the interneuron goes up to the brain via the white matter column. Then it's going to go down the white matter column depending on if it's somatic or visceral. Okay, so it goes down. So if we go to our control center, right? Everybody following that? Go to the control center, figuring out what we're going to do about it. Now we're going to come back down to the descending white column, right? But now we have to decide, what are we going to do about it? Is it going to be a visceral? Is it going to be something that we are unaware of? Or is it going to be something that we're aware of? Is it going to be something voluntary or involuntary? So I'm telling you your hair got plucked. What are you going to do about it? You're probably going to scratch your head. Is that voluntary or involuntary?
Voluntary.
Voluntary, right? So now we need to understand, where does that next synapse occur? The next synapse will be like this. If it's visceral, it will be lateral gray horn. If it's somatic, it's going to be anterior gray horn. So this area right here, so I'm going to use red for our efferent division, right? So we have, first we have afferent, right? Efferent is going to be either, it's going to be our, okay. Efferent is going to be somatic or visceral motor. Okay? It's a motor response because it's going to be an action. We're going to do something, right? Okay? Now, this can happen in two places. You have the lateral, this is called the lateral gray horn. Okay? This will be for visceral. Lateral gray horn will be for visceral. Not just visceral, visceral motor.
So is that always like on and on?
Yes.
Oh.
Always. Yes. And the reason why this is important is because it's going to come into a place when we're talking about either the ventral ramus or the posterior ramus when we're talking about that rami communicantes, which I'll explain. Okay? So just remember, visceral and somatic is going to decide the direction we're going next. Okay. This other portion, this anterior portion, all of this area, right? This is going to be somatic. Somatic what? Somatic motor. Okay? It's a somatic motor response. It's not a somatic sense, because that happens only in the posterior gray horns. That only goes through the dorsal root ganglia. It's just, you got to remember, it starts as a sense. We sense something. Then we go up to the brain, to the control center, to figure out what we're going to do about it. Then we come back down the descending white column. And now, depending on what we're going to do about it, if it's something that we're aware of, or something we're not aware of, is going to determine where synapse is. Or if it's voluntary or involuntary, is going to determine where we synapse. Question?
So this is all somatic?
The one we're doing is our hair being pulled is somatic. Yes. So the example with the hair being plucked is somatic. Because first it's ouch, you got a tactile receptor, so it's a somatic response, right? Something physically happened to you. It's not like something is going on within you, right? It's just something physically happened to you. You plucked the hair, right? Okay? So first it was a somatic sensory. Then the interneuron took it up to the brain via the ascending white column. Then then it's telling us, okay, well, we need to scratch our head because that nerve kind of, or itch, or whatever, right? So now we're going to go down the descending white column. And now we got to determine, okay, where are we going to synapse? Are we going to go lateral great horn, or are we going to go anterior great horn? You tell me. Anterior. Anterior great horn because we're going to scratch the head, which is a somatic response, right? Okay, so we're going to synapse here. Okay? Now, the last step. White matter columns work like this. So I'm going to kind of just touch over this real quick. The white matter, ascending will always be sensory. So this section, when you're going up, will be sensory. The ascending white matter column is only sensory. The descending white matter column is going to be motor. Motor. Okay? Okay, now this is kind of where it gets a little bit more confusing. The descending white matter column. So remember, if we're looking at it, we have the gray horn, right? We have the lateral gray horn. So we synapsed here, right, for our somatic. Everybody following? In the posterior gray horn, we took an interneuron to the posterior white column. Everybody see that? The posterior white column, which is going to take us ascending. Okay, so we're going up, which is sensory. Now we're going to descend in the anterior white column. Okay, we descend in the anterior white column. Okay, we come down, and that's going to be motor, because now we need to synapse either here, lateral, or anterior. Does that make sense? That's what I'm talking about. Okay, this is where it gets a little bit more confusing. So now we've synapsed, right? We all agree we've done both synapses, we're good. Now we got to come back out. Okay, we have to come back out. So what we're going to do is we get to the spinal nerve. So we're going to come out, we're always going to come out the ventral rootlets, right? To the ventral root, to the spinal nerve. Agree? Okay. The dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. The dorsal ramus is going to innervate skeletal muscle. So dorsal ramus will be for a somatic response. So if it ever synapses in the anterior great horn, you know that you're going to take the dorsal ramus. Okay?
Say that again?
Okay. The dorsal ramus is going to innervate skeletal muscle. Okay? Does that make sense? It's going to go do something to skeletal muscle, causing it to do something. So the model I really want is that spinal cord one, because you can, or the big one. 'Cause you can, no, there's one that it shows the dura pia and arachnoid matter on it. It has all of it.
That's the one that we went over it with her.
You did? Okay, because technically she could throw a curveball at you. You can see the Rami community contest on that.
Yeah.
The big bulge in the front, the two big bulges in the front. Okay. Okay. So if we're looking at that one, and you have okay, so because here you only see where the spinal nerve is, right? Eventually it's got to connect to the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. Okay? The dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus together will form the rami communicantis. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because the rami communicantis is what's going to link up to that sympathetic chain ganglia. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes. Okay, so we've synapsed here. Now we need, it's a somatic response. So we're going to come back out, but we came in this way, right? So now we're going to leave this one. The ventral rootlets to the ventral root to the spinal nerve. Okay? Now I'm telling you that there's two ramuses. Okay? There's the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. And I'm telling you, if it's somatic, it's always going to be the dorsal ramus.